The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable sharp as broken glass cutting through the fog of my grief. Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back. Jessica's voice was ice-cold, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the mahogany doorframe of what had been my home for 37 years. The same doorframe where I'd measured my son Marcus's height as he grew from a chubby-cheeked toddler to the man who now stood behind his wife, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I stood there in my black funeral dress, still smelling of cemetery earth and wilted lilies, trying to process what was happening. Just 6 hours ago, I had watched them lower my Richard into the ground. 6 hours ago, I was surrounded by mourners offering their condolences, telling me how sorry they were for my loss, how Richard had been such a good man, such a devoted husband and father. Now I was being thrown out of my own home by my daughter-in-law while my only child watched in silence. Jessica, surely we can discuss this tomorrow. I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse from crying. It's been such a difficult day, and I just need... You need to leave, she interrupted, her blonde hair catching the porch light like a halo, making her look angelic even as she spoke with the voice of a demon. This house belongs to Marcus now. Richard left everything to him in his will. We've already spoken to the lawyer. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. Richard had never mentioned changing his will. We had made our wills together 15 years ago, leaving everything to each other, then to Marcus when we were both gone. But I was still here. I was still alive. How could everything belong to Marcus when I was still breathing, still grieving, still needing a place to mourn my husband of 42 years? That can't be right, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I saw something flicker in Marcus's eyes. Guilt. Shame. Knowledge. He knew. He had known this was going to happen, and he had said nothing. Done nothing to stop it. Marcus, I pleaded, turning to my son, the boy I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, cheered for at every soccer game and school play. Marcus, sweetheart, surely there's been a mistake. This is my home too. This is where your father and I... Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't look at me directly, his gaze fixed somewhere over my left shoulder. Dad made his wishes clear. He wanted the house to go to us. He said you'd be better off somewhere smaller, somewhere you could start fresh. Start fresh. As if 42 years of marriage could be wiped clean like chalk from a blackboard. As if the memories soaked into every wall, every floorboard, every corner of this house meant nothing. As if I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded now that Richard was gone. I looked around at the home we had built together. The front porch where Richard had proposed on a warm June evening, getting down on one knee right there by the swing we'd bought at a garage sale during our first year of marriage. The rose bushes I'd planted when Marcus was born, now tall and established, their roots deep in the soil just as mine should have been in this place. The windows where I'd watched for Richard to come home from work every evening, where I'd waited up during his business trips, where I'd drawn the curtains tight when we made love on lazy Sunday mornings. I need to see the will, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I need to speak to our lawyer. Howard Brennan has been handling our affairs for 20 years. He would have told me if Richard had changed. Mr. Brennan retired last year, Jessica said smoothly, pulling a folded document from her purse. Richard switched to a new firm. Everything's been properly executed, I assure you. You can examine the papers if you'd like, but it won't change anything. You have until Sunday to collect your personal belongings. Anything else stays with the house. Anything else stays with the house. My grandmother's china that had survived the Great Depression. The photo albums documenting 4 decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. The wedding dress I'd saved hoping Marcus might want it for his bride someday, though Jessica had chosen something else entirely, something that cost more than Richard's first car. All of it was being taken from me as casually as if they were discussing the weather. I reached for the document with trembling fingers, but the legal language swam before my eyes. I couldn't focus, couldn't make sense of the formal terms and clauses. All I could see was Richard's signature at the bottom, bold and familiar, dated just 3 months ago. 3 months ago, when he told me he was going to visit his doctor for his annual checkup. When he'd kissed me goodbye that morning and said he'd be home for dinner. When he'd seemed perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, perfectly alive. 3 months ago, I whispered, staring at the date. He signed this 3 months ago and never said a word to me. He was protecting you, Mom, Marcus said, finally meeting my eyes. He knew you'd be upset. He thought it would be easier this way. Easier. There was that word again, as if my entire life could be reduced to what was easiest for everyone else. As if I was a child who needed to be shielded from difficult decisions about my own future. As if Richard had the right to determine where I would live, how I would grieve, what would become of me after he was gone, all without bothering to include me in the conversation. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how defeated. All our friends, our life, everything is here. The church where we were married, where Richard's funeral was held this morning. The grocery store where I've shopped for 20 years, where everyone knows my name. The doctor who's been treating me since Marcus was little. How can I just leave all of that behind? Jessica's expression didn't soften even slightly. If anything, her blue eyes grew colder. You're a capable woman, Eleanor. You'll figure it out. People start over all the time. People start over all the time. Not 63-year-old widows whose entire world had just crumbled around them. Not women who had spent their adult lives building a home, a community, a life with a man who had apparently been planning to uproot them from it all without so much as a conversation. I looked at Marcus again, searching his face for any sign of the sweet boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who had cried when he scraped his knee and only I could make it better with a kiss and a bandage decorated with cartoon characters. But that boy was gone, replaced by a stranger who could watch his mother be cast out into the night without lifting a finger to help her. I'll need more than 3 days, I said, trying to summon some dignity from somewhere deep inside myself. I'll need time to find a place to live, to arrange movers, to figure out my finances. You have until Sunday, Jessica repeated firmly. That's 4 days, counting today. It's plenty of time. 4 days to dismantle a lifetime. 4 days to say goodbye to everything I'd ever known. 4 days to figure out how to survive without Richard, without my home, without my son, without anything that had given my life meaning for the past 4 decades. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself on the ground and sob until they took pity on me, until Marcus remembered that I was his mother, and chose me over the woman he'd married just 2 years ago. I wanted to demand answers, to know why Richard had done this, why he had betrayed me so completely in his final months. But I could see in their faces that none of it would matter. Their minds were made up. The papers were signed. The house was theirs, and I was nothing more than an unwanted remnant of a man who was already buried and forgotten. So instead I nodded. I folded the will carefully and handed it back to Jessica. I walked past them both, into the house that was no longer mine, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Richard and I had slept together for so many years. Where he had breathed his last breath just 5 days ago, holding my hand, telling me he loved me, promising that everything would be all right. Everything would be all right. What a lie that had turned out to be. I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at the indentation in Richard's pillow, still visible after 5 days. I could still smell his cologne on the pillowcase, still see where he'd left his reading glasses on the nightstand next to a half-finished mystery novel he would never get to finish. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the morning he died, except now it all belonged to someone else. The next 4 days passed in a haze of packing boxes and making phone calls. I found a small furnished apartment across town, the kind of place that rented month to month to people in transition. The walls were beige, the carpet was worn, and the kitchen was barely large enough for one person, but it was all I could afford on short notice. My Social Security wouldn't start for another 2 years, and I had no idea what kind of financial arrangements Richard had made for me, if any. I tried calling our bank, but they told me I'd need to speak to the executor of Richard's estate. I tried calling Howard Brennan, but his old secretary told me he was retired and living in Florida, and she didn't have a forwarding number. I tried calling the new law firm that had handled Richard's will, but they said they could only discuss the estate with Marcus, as he was the sole beneficiary and executor. Everything led back to my son, who hadn't answered my calls since the night they threw me out. Every time I dialed his number, it went straight to voicemail. I left message after message, asking him to call me back, asking him to explain what was happening, asking him to help me understand why his father had done this to me. But Marcus remained silent, leaving me to navigate this nightmare alone. On Sunday morning, I packed the last of my personal belongings into my old Honda Civic. 42 years of marriage reduced to whatever I could fit in my car and a few boxes I'd asked my neighbor to store in her garage. I'd had to leave behind my grandmother's china, my photo albums, my wedding dress, my books, my furniture, everything that had made our house a home. Jessica had watched from the front window as I loaded my car, making sure I didn't take anything that wasn't explicitly mine. As I drove away from Maple Street for the last time, I caught a glimpse of Marcus in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the doorway, watching me leave, but he made no move to stop me, no gesture of farewell. I waited for him to run after me, to change his mind, to remember that I was his mother, and invite me back. But he just stood there until I turned the corner, and he disappeared from view. The furnished apartment felt like a prison cell after the spacious house I'd left behind. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors arguing, their television blaring, their children running up and down the hallway at all hours. I'd gone from a quiet neighborhood where I knew everyone to a place where I was just another faceless tenant, another lonely person hiding behind a locked door. I tried to establish a routine. I went grocery shopping at the small market down the street, where no one knew my name or asked about my husband's health like they used to at our old store. I found a new doctor, a young woman who had no knowledge of my medical history and seemed rushed during our brief appointment. I located the nearest library, where I could sit among strangers and pretend to read while really just trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. But at night, alone in that small, dark apartment, the questions tormented me. Why had Richard changed his will without telling me? Why had he left me with nothing, no security, no home, no explanation? How long had he been planning this betrayal? And most painful of all, how long had Marcus known what was going to happen to me? 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, I was sorting through a box of papers I'd brought from the house when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a credit card statement, dated 2 months before Richard's death, addressed to our old house but with charges I didn't recognize. Expensive dinners at restaurants Richard and I had never been to. Hotel bills in cities we'd never visited. Charges at jewelry stores, flower shops, and boutiques I'd never heard of. My hands shook as I stared at the statement. Richard had hidden a credit card from me. He'd been spending money on things I knew nothing about, going places I'd never been, buying gifts for someone who wasn't me. The statement showed a balance of over $8,000, money that had been spent in the months leading up to his death while I'd been worrying about our budget and clipping coupons to save on groceries. I drove to the credit card company's local office the next morning, the statement clutched in my trembling hands. A sympathetic customer service representative confirmed what I already suspected. Richard had opened the account 18 months ago, listing only himself as the cardholder. He'd been making minimum payments from a checking account I didn't know existed. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Patterson," the young man behind the desk said gently. "Unfortunately, since you weren't a joint account holder, I can't give you detailed information about the charges. But I can tell you that the balance has been paid off. Someone cleared the account completely about 2 weeks ago." Someone had paid off Richard's secret credit card. Someone who knew about the hidden account, who had access to funds I couldn't locate, who was cleaning up the financial evidence of my husband's deception. And I had a terrible suspicion I knew exactly who that someone was. I went home and searched through the rest of the papers more carefully, and that's when I found the bank statements for an account at a different bank, one Richard had never mentioned. The account had been opened 3 years ago, shortly after Marcus's wedding to Jessica. Every month, Richard had transferred money from our joint checking account into this secret account, small amounts that I'd never noticed were missing. Over 3 years, he'd accumulated nearly $40,000 that I'd never known existed. The final statement, dated just 1 week before Richard's death, showed that the entire balance had been transferred out of the account. $40,000, gone to an account number I didn't recognize at yet another bank. Someone had cleaned out Richard's secret savings, just like they'd paid off his secret credit card. Someone who had known exactly what accounts existed and how to access them. I sat in my tiny apartment kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, and tried to make sense of what I was discovering. Richard hadn't just changed his will to leave me homeless. He'd been systematically hiding money from me for years, creating secret accounts, living a double life I'd never suspected. And now someone was covering up the financial trail, making sure all evidence of Richard's deception disappeared. That someone had to be Marcus. He was the executor of Richard's estate, the one with access to all of Richard's accounts and records. He was the one who would know about any hidden money. He was the one who could authorize transfers and payments. My own son was helping to hide his father's betrayal from me, making sure I would never know the full extent of what had been done to me. I called Marcus again that night, and this time he answered. "Mom," he said, his voice cautious. "How are you settling in?" "I found some bank statements," I said without preamble. "And credit card bills. From accounts I didn't know existed." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Mom, I think he should focus on moving forward," Marcus finally said. "Dad's gone. Dwelling on financial details isn't going to bring him back." "Moving forward?" I repeated, incredulous. "Marcus, your father hid money from me. He had secret accounts, secret credit cards. He was spending thousands of dollars on things I know nothing about. Don't you think I have a right to know what he was doing with our money? It was his money, Mom. He earned it. He had a right to spend it however he wanted. His money. As if the 42 years I'd spent managing his household, raising his child, supporting his career, being his wife and partner meant nothing. As if I'd been nothing more than a dependent, a charity case he'd grudgingly supported until death freed him from the obligation. "I was his wife," I said, my voice breaking. "We were supposed to be partners. We were supposed to share everything. How could he hide so much from me? How could you help him hide it? I'm not hiding anything, Marcus said, but I could hear the lie in his voice. Look, Mom, I have to go. Jessica and I have plans tonight. Maybe we can talk later this week. Marcus, wait. But the line was already dead. My son had hung up on me, cutting off the conversation before I could ask the questions that were burning inside me. Questions about where the hidden money had gone, what Richard had been spending it on, and why my own child was helping to cover up the truth. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the narrow bed in my rented room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, thinking about the man I'd been married to for 4 decades. I'd thought I knew Richard Patterson better than anyone in the world. I'd known how he liked his coffee, what made him laugh, the way his face looked when he was concentrating on a problem at work. I'd known his body as well as my own, had held him through illness and celebrated with him during good times. We'd created a child together, built a life together, grown old together. But apparently, I'd known nothing at all. The Richard the first thought I'd married would never have left me homeless. He would never have hidden money from me, never would have made major decisions about our future without including me. The Richard I'd loved had been gentle and honest, a man who brought me flowers on our anniversary and held my hand during scary movies. He'd been my best friend, my lover, my partner in everything. Who was the man who had died in our bed 5 days ago? Who was the stranger who had systematically betrayed me while looking into my eyes every morning and telling me he loved me? I got up and made myself a cup of tea, sitting at the small kitchen table in my nightgown, trying to piece together the clues. The secret accounts had started 3 years ago, right after Marcus's wedding. The credit card had been opened 18 months ago. The will had been changed 3 months ago. There was a timeline here, a progression of deception that had accelerated in Richard's final months. Had he been sick longer than he told me? Had he known he was dying and made these arrangements to ensure I'd be taken care of after he was gone? But if that was the case, why had he left everything to Marcus instead of providing for me directly? Why had he hidden the money instead of talking to me about our future? Unless he hadn't been trying to provide for me at all. Unless everything he'd done had been designed to benefit someone else entirely. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Richard had been having an affair. The secret credit card charges, the hotel bills, the expensive dinners and jewelry purchases, it all pointed to another woman. Someone he'd been spending money on, someone he'd cared enough about to hide from me for months or even years. But who? And how did Marcus fit into all of this? Was my son protecting his father's memory by covering up the affair? Or was there something even worse going on, something that explained why both of them had been so determined to get me out of the house as quickly as possible? I decided I needed to see those credit card statements more carefully. I needed to know exactly where Richard had been going, what he'd been buying, who he'd been with. If he'd been having an affair, there would be evidence. There always was. The next morning, I drove to the credit card company again and asked to speak to a supervisor. I explained that I was trying to settle my husband's estate and needed detailed information about his charges. After some discussion and a review of Richard's death certificate, they agreed to provide me with 12 months of detailed statements. What I found there made me feel sick to my stomach. Richard had been spending money regularly at a hotel called the Grandview Manor, an upscale place about 20 miles from our house. He'd been there at least twice a month for the past year, always paying for a room, always staying for just a few hours in the afternoon. The charges showed he'd also been buying expensive meals at the hotel's restaurant, bottles of champagne, spa services for 2 people. He'd been buying jewelry at Tiffany & Company, flowers from an expensive florist, lingerie from boutiques I'd never shopped at. He'd paid for weekend trips to romantic destinations, Charleston, Savannah, Asheville, Places we'd talked about visiting together but somehow never had time for. Places he'd been visiting with someone else while telling me he was working late or visiting his brother in Atlanta. The evidence was overwhelming. My husband of 42 years had been having an affair, and he'd been spending our money to do it. Our retirement savings, the money we'd scrimped and saved for our golden years together, had been funding his relationship with another woman. I sat in my car in the credit card company's parking lot, crying over the printed statements, mourning not just the husband I'd lost but the marriage I'd thought I'd had. Everything had been a lie. Every "I love you." In recent months, every kiss goodbye, every night he'd held me in his arms had been tainted by his betrayal. He'd been living a double life, playing the role of devoted husband while secretly planning a future that didn't include me. But I still didn't understand why he'd left everything to Marcus. If Richard had been planning to leave me for his mistress, why hadn't he simply asked for a divorce? Why the elaborate deception with the will and the secret accounts? Why had he died in our bed, holding my hand, instead of running away with the woman he'd apparently chosen over me? And why was Marcus helping to cover it all up? I drove home with more questions than answers, but I was determined to find the truth. I couldn't bring Richard back, couldn't undo the betrayal or reclaim the life I'd lost, but I could at least understand what had happened to me. I owed myself that much. That evening, I called the Grandview Manor and asked to speak to the manager. I explained that my husband had died recently, and I was trying to track down some business expenses for tax purposes. Could they tell me if Richard Patterson had been a regular guest? "Oh, Mrs. Patterson," the woman said, and I could hear the sympathy in her voice. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Patterson was indeed a regular guest here. Such a lovely man. He always spoke so fondly of his family." His family? I gripped the phone tighter. "Can you tell me, was he usually alone when he visited?" There was a pause. "Well, I shouldn't really discuss other guests' private business, but since you're his widow, no, he wasn't alone. He always came with a young woman. A lovely blonde lady. They seemed very close." A young blonde woman. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Do you remember anything else about her? Her name, perhaps? I'm sorry, but I really can't share personal information about other guests. But I will say, they seemed very happy together. Very much in love. Very much in love. I thanked the hotel manager and hung up, my hands shaking. Richard had been in love with someone else. A young blonde woman he'd been meeting at expensive hotels, taking on romantic trips, buying jewelry for while I sat at home worrying about our budget. A young blonde woman who sounded exactly like Jessica. The thought hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making me grab the edge of the kitchen counter for support. Jessica. My daughter-in-law. The woman who had so coldly thrown me out of my own home, who had stood by while Marcus betrayed his own mother, who had shown not 1 ounce of sympathy for my grief. Could Richard have been having an affair with his own daughter-in-law? I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was being paranoid, letting grief and anger cloud my judgment. But the more I considered it, the more the pieces began to fit together. Jessica's coldness toward me, especially in recent months. The way she'd taken control of the funeral arrangements, insisting on decisions that excluded me. The way she'd known exactly what was in Richard's will, had been prepared with legal documents and moving timelines. The way Marcus had deferred to her completely, unable to meet my eyes, clearly torn between loyalty to his wife and whatever remained of his love for his mother. Jessica was young, beautiful, and calculating. She'd married Marcus when he was vulnerable, fresh out of a difficult divorce, lonely and eager to start over. She'd insinuated herself into our family quickly, always finding reasons to visit, always volunteering to help with family gatherings, always positioning herself as the perfect daughter-in-law. But what if it had all been an act? What if she'd been targeting Richard from the beginning, seducing him while pretending to love his son? What if everything, the marriage to Marcus, the involvement in our family, the friendly visits and helpful gestures, had been part of a long-term plan to get her hands on Richard's money? I thought about the secret accounts, the hidden money that had disappeared so completely after Richard's death. Jessica would have known about those accounts if she'd been having an affair with him. She would have known about the will change, would have helped plan it. She might even have been the one to suggest it, convincing Richard that leaving everything to Marcus was the best way to provide for her future while keeping me from discovering the truth about their relationship. And Marcus, my poor, foolish son. Did he know what his wife had been doing? Was he complicit in the betrayal, or was he just another victim of Jessica's manipulation? Had she convinced him that throwing me out was for my own good, that Richard's wishes had to be respected no matter how cruel they seemed? I spent the rest of the evening going through everything I knew about Jessica, looking for clues I might have missed. She'd appeared in Marcus's life so suddenly, just 6 months after his divorce was finalized. She'd been working as a real estate agent, she'd said, though I'd never seen any evidence of her career. She claimed to be from Atlanta originally, but she never talked about her family or her past. She had no close friends that I'd ever met, no hobbies or interests beyond shopping and decorating. She'd been like a beautiful, charming blank slate, becoming whatever Marcus needed her to be. The perfect wife, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the woman who could step seamlessly into our family and make everyone love her. Except I'd never loved her. I'd tried, for Marcus's sake, but something about Jessica had always made me uncomfortable. She'd been too perfect, too polished, too quick with the right words and gestures. I'd attributed my discomfort to typical mother-in-law jealousy, the natural difficulty of sharing my son with another woman. But maybe my instincts had been right all along. Maybe I'd sensed, on some subconscious level, that Jessica wasn't what she seemed. I needed proof. I needed to know for certain whether my suspicions were correct, or whether grief was making me imagine conspiracies where none existed. I needed to find evidence of Richard's affair, evidence that would either confirm or disprove Jessica's involvement. The next morning, I drove to our old neighborhood. I parked down the street from what had been my house and watched as Jessica left for work in her red BMW. Then I walked to the house next door, where my neighbor Margaret had lived for 20 years. Margaret invited me in for coffee, expressing her sympathy for Richard's death and her shock at my sudden departure from the neighborhood. "I couldn't believe it when I saw you packing up," she said, shaking her gray head sadly. "After all these years, to have to leave so quickly after Richard passed. It just doesn't seem right." "Margaret," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In the months before Richard died, did you ever notice anything unusual? Anyone coming to the house when I wasn't there?" Margaret's expression grew uncomfortable. She busied herself with pouring coffee, avoiding my eyes. "Eleanor, I don't like to gossip about the neighbors." "Please," I said. "I need to know. Richard. I think Richard may have been having an affair. I found evidence of secret accounts, hidden expenses. If someone was coming to my house when I wasn't there, I need to know who it was." Margaret sighed heavily and sat down across from me. "There was someone," she admitted reluctantly. "I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure what I was seeing, and it wasn't really my business. But yes, there were visits." My heart clenched. "Who was it?" "It was Jessica," Margaret said quietly. "Marcus's wife." She would come by in the afternoons, usually on days when I knew you were at your book club or volunteering at the hospital. She'd park in the garage so the car wouldn't be visible from the street. I only noticed because I was doing yard work and saw her coming and going through the back gate. How long had this been going on? Months. Maybe longer. I started noticing it in the spring, but it could have been happening before that. I just assumed she was helping Richard with something, maybe planning a surprise for you or helping him with household tasks while he wasn't feeling well. Richard had been complaining of fatigue and occasional chest pains for months before his death. But every time I'd suggested he see a doctor, he'd brushed off my concerns. I'd assumed he was just getting older, that the minor aches and pains were normal for a man his age. But what if he'd been hiding a serious illness from me? What if he'd known he was dying and had confided in Jessica instead of his own wife? Did you ever see them together? I asked. Richard and Jessica, I mean. Margaret nodded reluctantly. Once. I was upstairs in my bedroom, and I happened to look out the window into your backyard. They were sitting on your patio, talking very intently. Very intimately. I only saw them for a moment before I realized I was intruding and moved away from the window. But Eleanor, they were holding hands. Holding hands. My husband and my daughter-in-law, holding hands in my own backyard while I was out volunteering at the hospital. The betrayal was complete, absolute, devastating. I'm so sorry, Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. I should have said something, should have warned you. But I convinced myself I was seeing things, that there had to be an innocent explanation. I never imagined. It's not your fault, I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. You couldn't have known what was really happening. But I should have known. I should have noticed the signs, should have questioned Richard's sudden need for privacy, his new habits and unexplained absences. I should have trusted my instincts about Jessica, should have paid attention to the way she looked at Richard when she thought no one was watching, the way she always found excuses to touch his arm or sit next to him at family gatherings. I'd been blind, willfully ignorant, choosing to trust the people I loved instead of believing the evidence of my own eyes. And now I was paying the price for that trust. I thanked Margaret for her honesty and walked back to my car, my mind reeling with the confirmation of my worst fears. Richard had been having an affair with Jessica. My husband had betrayed me with my own daughter-in-law, and together they had planned to leave me with nothing after his death. But I still didn't understand the full scope of their plan. If Richard and Jessica were in love, why hadn't they simply asked for a divorce so they could be together? Why the elaborate deception with secret accounts and will changes? Why had Richard died in our bed instead of running away with the woman he'd chosen over me? Unless Richard's death hadn't been as natural as everyone assumed. The thought chilled me to the bone. Richard had died in his sleep, peacefully, without pain or struggle. The doctor had said his heart had simply stopped, that it sometimes happened to men his age, especially those with underlying cardiovascular issues. There had been no autopsy, no investigation, no reason to suspect anything other than natural causes. But what if it hadn't been natural? What if Jessica had decided that waiting for Richard to leave me wasn't fast enough? What if she'd found a way to speed up the process, to ensure that she could have Marcus and Richard's money without the messiness of a divorce or the risk of Richard changing his mind about leaving his wife? I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was letting paranoia run wild. But the more I considered everything that had happened, the more convinced I became that Richard's death had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to benefit Jessica. She'd known exactly what was in his will. She'd been prepared with legal documents and timelines for my eviction. She'd paid off his secret accounts and credit cards, cleaning up the financial evidence before anyone else could examine it. She'd taken control of the funeral arrangements, making sure everything was handled quickly and efficiently, with no delays that might lead to questions or investigations. And she'd convinced Marcus to help her, to betray his own mother in service of a plan that would leave Jessica wealthy and secure while I was left with nothing. I drove home to my tiny apartment, my mind churning with possibilities and suspicions. I needed to find out more about Jessica's background, her history, her real motivations for marrying Marcus. I needed to know if she'd ever been involved in anything like this before, if there were other victims, other families she'd targeted and destroyed. But first, I needed to confront Marcus. I needed to look my son in the eye and ask him directly what he knew about his wife's relationship with his father. I needed to force him to choose between the truth and the lies that were destroying what remained of our family. I called Marcus that evening, and once again, he answered reluctantly. "Mom, I really can't talk long," he said before I could speak. "Jessica and I are heading out to dinner." "I know about the affair," I said without preamble. "I know about Jessica and your father. I have credit card statements, hotel records, witness accounts. I know everything." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, asking who was on the phone, and Marcus's muffled response as he covered the receiver. "Mom," he finally said, his voice strained. "I think you're letting grief make you paranoid. Dad would never." "Your father was meeting Jessica at the Grandview Manor twice a month for over a year," I interrupted. "He was buying her jewelry, taking her on romantic trips, spending thousands of dollars on their affair while I clipped coupons to save money on groceries." The hotel staff confirmed it, Marcus. They remembered them together. They said they looked very much in love. Another long silence. I could hear Jessica's voice again, more insistent now, and Marcus telling her to give him a minute. "Even if that were true," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what do you want me to do about it? Dad's dead. Nothing can change what happened." "What I want," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "is for you to tell me the truth. Did you know? Did you know your wife was sleeping with your father while she was married to you? Did you help them plan this whole thing, or are you just another one of Jessica's victims? You're talking crazy, Mom. You need help. You need to see a therapist or something, work through your grief instead of making up conspiracy theories." But I could hear it in his voice, the doubt, the uncertainty, the fear. Marcus wasn't sure about anything anymore. Maybe he'd suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to confront it. Maybe Jessica had convinced him that his instincts were wrong, that his mother was the problem, that cutting me out of their lives was the only way to move forward. "Marcus," I said more gently, "I know this is hard to hear. I know it's devastating to think that the people you trusted most in the world could betray you this way. But you're my son. You're the only family I have left. If there's any part of you that still loves me, that still cares about the truth, then please help me understand what really happened." I heard him take a shaky breath. "Mom, I can't," Jessica says. "What does Jessica say, sweetheart? What has she told you about your father's death? About the money? About why I had to be thrown out of my own home so quickly?" "She says you're dangerous," Marcus blurted out. "She says you blame her for Dad's death, that you might try to hurt her. She says the only way we can be safe is if you stay away from us completely." Dangerous. Jessica had convinced my own son that I was a threat to their safety. She'd isolated him from me so completely that he believed his grieving mother was capable of violence. It was a masterful manipulation, ensuring that Marcus would never listen to my suspicions or consider the possibility that his wife wasn't the victim she pretended to be. "Marcus," I said, tears streaming down my face, "I would never hurt anyone. You know that. You've known me your entire life. When have I ever been violent? When have I ever been anything but loving toward you and your family? I know, Mom. I know you wouldn't normally, but grief can change people. It can make them do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. Jessica's just being cautious." Jessica was being cautious, all right. She was making sure that Marcus would never believe anything I said, would never question her version of events, would never dig deeper into the truth about his father's death and her role in it. "I'm going to find out what really happened," I told him. "I'm going to keep investigating until I know the whole truth. And when I do, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Jessica did to our family. Mom, please." "I love you, Marcus," I said. "No matter what Jessica has convinced you to believe about me, I will always love you. And someday, when you're ready to hear the truth, I'll be here." I hung up before he could respond, before Jessica could take the phone away from him and poison his mind further against me. I sat in my small kitchen, crying for the son I'd lost along with everything else, mourning the family that had been systematically destroyed by a woman who had never loved any of us. But my tears didn't last long. They were replaced by something harder, stronger, more determined. Jessica might have won this round, might have convinced Marcus to betray his own mother and stolen the life I'd built over 4 decades. But she'd made one crucial mistake: she'd underestimated me. I wasn't the helpless widow she thought I was. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into my rented apartment and let her get away with what she'd done. I was going to find proof of her crimes, evidence that would expose her for what she really was. And when I did, I was going to make sure she paid for every lie she told, every life she'd destroyed, every moment of pain she caused. Over the next few days, I began my investigation in earnest. I went to the library and used their computers to research Jessica's background, searching for any information about her life before she'd married Marcus. What I found was troubling. There was almost no trace of Jessica Morrison before she'd appeared in our lives 3 years ago. She'd claimed to be from Atlanta, but there was no record of a Jessica Morrison working as a real estate agent there. She'd said she'd graduated from the University of Georgia, but when I called their alumni office, they had no record of anyone by that name. She'd mentioned growing up in a small town outside Atlanta, but when I searched for birth records, obituaries, anything that might confirm her story, I found nothing. It was as if Jessica Morrison had materialized out of thin air, perfectly crafted to be exactly what Marcus needed after his painful divorce. She had no past, no family, no connections to anyone or anything that might contradict the persona she'd created. But everyone came from somewhere. Everyone had a history, a trail of records and relationships that proved their existence. If Jessica Morrison didn't exist before 3 years ago, then who was the woman who had married my son and seduced my husband? I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Caruso who specialized in background checks and missing persons cases. It cost me money I couldn't afford, eating into the small savings account I'd managed to keep hidden from Richard, but I needed professional help to uncover the truth about Jessica. Frank called me 3 days later with results that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice grim, "you were right to be suspicious. The woman your son married isn't Jessica Morrison. Her real name is Jennifer Caldwell, and she has a very interesting criminal history." Jennifer Caldwell. Even her name had been a lie. "She's been running this same con for years," Frank continued. "She targets recently divorced men, usually older men with money and assets. She marries them, gains their trust, then systematically drains their bank accounts. Sometimes she simply disappears with the money. Other times, if the payoff is big enough, she waits for them to die and inherits everything. How many times has she done this? At least 4 that I can document. Her first husband died in a car accident 6 months after they were married, leaving her a substantial life insurance payout. The second one died of a heart attack, natural causes, according to the death certificate, but the timing was awfully convenient. The third one figured out what she was doing and tried to divorce her, but he died of food poisoning before the divorce was finalized. The fourth one simply disappeared, along with his entire life savings. Food poisoning, heart attack, car accident. A pattern of convenient deaths that had made Jennifer Caldwell, Jessica Morrison, very wealthy over the years. What about the missing husband? I asked. Thomas Brennan. Disappeared 2 years ago. His body was never found, but his bank accounts were cleaned out the day after he vanished. The police suspected foul play, but they could never prove anything. Jennifer had moved on to a new city, a new identity, and a new target by the time they started investigating. Thomas Brennan. The same last name as our old lawyer, Howard Brennan. Was that a coincidence, or had Jessica specifically targeted our family because she'd somehow learned about our financial situation through Howard's practice? Frank, I said, my heart pounding, I think she killed my husband. I think she found a way to make his death look natural while she was having an affair with him. It's possible, Frank said grimly. She's smart, careful, and she's had a lot of practice. But proving murder when the death certificate says natural causes is going to be very difficult, especially this long after the fact. What about the other deaths? Weren't the police suspicious about the pattern? Different jurisdictions, different names, different stories. She's careful never to stay in one place long enough to establish a pattern. She reinvents herself completely between victims, new name, new background, new appearance. If I hadn't been specifically looking for her, I never would have connected Jennifer Caldwell to Jessica Morrison. So she's gotten away with it. She's killed multiple people and stolen their money, and no one has ever been able to stop her. Until now, Frank said. Now we know who she really is. Now we have documentation of her pattern, her methods, her real identity. That gives us leverage. Leverage. I like the sound of that word. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt like I had some power, some ability to fight back against the woman who had destroyed my life. What do we do next? I asked. We gather more evidence. We document everything. The financial transfers, the secret accounts, the timeline of your husband's death. We build a case that's so solid no one can ignore it. And then we make Jessica's life very, very difficult. I spent the next 2 weeks working with Frank to compile evidence of Jessica's crimes. We documented the pattern of her previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. We traced the money from Richard's secret accounts, and showed how it had been transferred to accounts Jessica controlled. We gathered witness statements from the hotel staff who had seen Jessica and Richard together, from neighbors who had observed their affair, from anyone who could corroborate the story of betrayal and deception. But our most crucial piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Richard's doctor. I had called Dr. Martinez to ask about Richard's health in his final months, hoping to understand whether he'd known he was dying. What I learned instead was that Richard had been taking a new medication for his heart condition, a powerful drug that Dr. Martinez had never prescribed. I was concerned when I saw it listed in his chart. Dr. Martinez told me over the phone. The medication, Digitalis, can be very dangerous if not properly monitored. Too much can cause heart failure, especially in someone with Mr. Patterson's underlying conditions. When I asked him about it, he said another doctor had prescribed it, but he wouldn't tell me who. Digitalis. A heart medication that could kill if given in the wrong dose. A drug that Richard had been taking without his regular doctor's knowledge, prescribed by someone who remained anonymous. Doctor, I said carefully, if someone wanted to cause a heart attack, could they do it with Digitalis? There was a long pause. Mrs. Patterson, are you suggesting that your husband's death wasn't natural? I'm asking if it's possible. Hypothetically. Hypothetically, yes. An overdose of Digitalis would cause cardiac arrest. And if the person had been taking therapeutic doses for a while, it would be very difficult to detect poisoning in an autopsy. The drug would already be in their system at detectable levels. But there had been no autopsy. Jessica had insisted on cremation, had rushed the funeral arrangements, had made sure Richard's body was burned before anyone could ask questions about the cause of death. I thanked Dr. Martinez and immediately called Frank with this new information. We now had a clear method for how Jessica could have killed Richard, gradually poisoning him with heart medication while maintaining the appearance of natural illness and death. This is it, Frank said when I told him about the Digitalis. This is the smoking gun we needed. She's been doing this for years, probably using the same method each time. Get close to the victim, learn about their medical conditions, then use that knowledge to kill them in a way that looks natural. But can we prove it? Richard's been cremated. There's no body to examine, no way to test for poison. We don't need to prove this specific murder, Frank said. We just need to prove who she really is and show the pattern of her crimes. Once we expose Jennifer Caldwell, the police will have to reopen investigations into all her previous husband's deaths. And Marcus will finally see the truth about the woman he married. That evening, I called Marcus one more time. I needed to try once more to reach my son, to give him a chance to learn the truth before I took the evidence to the authorities. This time, Jessica answered his phone. Eleanor, she said, her voice cold and controlled. Marcus can't talk to you right now. He's made it very clear that he doesn't want any contact with you. Put my son on the phone, Jennifer, I said, using her real name deliberately. Or should I call you Jennifer Caldwell? That's your real name, isn't it? Not Jessica Morrison. The silence stretched out so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, more dangerous. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Eleanor, but you're playing a very dangerous game. The only dangerous person here is you, I said. I know what you did to Richard. I know about the Digitalis, about the poisoning, about all the other husbands you've killed over the years. Thomas Brennan, Michael Foster, David Chin. Should I go on? You can't prove anything, Jessica said, but I could hear the fear in her voice now. Richard died of natural causes. Everyone knows that. Everyone believed that because you made sure his body was cremated before anyone could ask questions. Just like you did with your other victims. But I know the truth now, Jennifer. I know who you really are. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. If you breathe a word of these ridiculous accusations to anyone, I'll destroy you. Jessica hissed. I'll have you committed as a delusional widow who can't accept her husband's death. I'll make sure you never see Marcus again, never have any contact with your grandchildren if he ever decides to have them. You'll die alone and forgotten. Just another crazy old woman whose own family couldn't stand to be around her. But her threats didn't frighten me anymore. I'd been living in fear since Richard's death, afraid of being alone, afraid of having nowhere to go, afraid of losing everything I'd ever cared about. Jessica had already taken all of that from me. She'd already isolated me from my son, destroyed my home, stolen my husband and my life savings. There was nothing left for her to threaten me with. "You're wrong about one thing, Jennifer," I said calmly. "I won't die alone and forgotten. But you might. Prison is a very lonely place for murderers." I hung up before she could respond, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, Frank and I would take our evidence to the police. We'd expose Jennifer Caldwell for the killer she was, and we'd make sure she never hurt another family the way she'd hurt mine. But first, I had one more thing to do. I drove to my old house, to Marcus and Jessica's house now, and parked across the street. It was late evening, and the windows glowed warmly in the darkness. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, the silhouettes of the people who had once been my family. I wasn't there to confront them or cause a scene. I was there to say goodbye to the life I'd lost, to mourn the family that had been destroyed, and to gather strength for the battle ahead. As I sat in my car, looking at the house where I'd raised my son and built my marriage, I thought about the woman I'd been just a month ago. That Eleanor Patterson had been trusting, naive, willing to believe the best of people even when the evidence suggested otherwise. She'd been dependent on others for her security and happiness, vulnerable to anyone who wanted to manipulate or betray her. But that woman was gone, buried along with her illusions about the people she'd loved. The woman who remained was harder, smarter, more determined. She'd learned that love could be weaponized, that trust could be fatal, that sometimes the people closest to you were the ones most capable of destroying you. But she'd also learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. She'd survived betrayal, abandonment, and loss that would have broken many people. She'd uncovered truths that others had tried to bury, fought back against people who'd assumed she would simply disappear quietly. She was nobody's victim anymore. The next morning, Frank and I walked into the police station with 3 boxes of evidence documenting Jennifer Caldwell's crimes. We met with Detective Sarah Chin, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to our story with growing interest and alarm. "This is quite an accusation," she said when we'd finished presenting our case. "Murder, fraud, identity theft. If even half of what you're alleging is true, this woman is one of the most successful serial killers I've ever encountered." "It's all true," I said firmly. "Every word. She's been getting away with murder for years because she's smart enough to make it look natural and mobile enough to stay ahead of any investigation." Detective Chin spent the rest of the day reviewing our evidence, making phone calls to other jurisdictions, checking databases for information about Jennifer Caldwell's previous identities and crimes. By late afternoon, she was convinced. "We're going to arrest her tonight," she told us. "Multiple charges, fraud, identity theft, and we'll start building the murder cases. With the evidence you've provided, we should be able to get search warrants for her financial records, her computer, her phone. If she's been as careless as most criminals eventually become, we'll find the proof we need." "What about Marcus?" I asked. "My son, he's been manipulated by her. He doesn't know who she really is." "We'll handle this carefully," Detective Chin assured me. "He may be a victim too, or he may be more involved than you realize. Either way, he'll have to be questioned as part of the investigation." That night, I sat in my small apartment and waited. Frank had promised to call me as soon as he heard anything from Detective Chin. I couldn't concentrate on television or books, couldn't sit still, couldn't do anything but pace and wonder whether justice would finally be served. The call came at 11:30. "She's gone," Frank said grimly. By the time the police got to the house, Jennifer Caldwell had disappeared. Her car is missing, her personal belongings are gone, and there's no sign of her anywhere. "What about Marcus?" "He's fine physically." Shocked, confused, devastated. He had no idea his wife was planning to run. Says she told him she was going to bed early with a headache, and when he woke up this morning, she was gone. Gone. After everything, after all our careful planning and evidence gathering, Jennifer, had slipped away in the night like the predator she'd always been. She'd probably sensed that the net was closing around her, had taken whatever money she could grab and disappeared to start over somewhere else with a new identity and new victims. Did she take anything else? I asked. That's the interesting part, Frank said. She cleaned out all of Richard's secret accounts, the ones you found evidence of. Transferred everything to offshore accounts that will be nearly impossible to trace. But she left behind a lot of cash and jewelry, things that would have been easy to carry. It's like she was in a hurry, like something spooked her. Something had spooked her, all right. My phone call the night before, when I'd used her real name and mentioned her previous victims. She'd realized that her cover was blown, that someone had connected Jennifer Caldwell to Jessica Morrison. Rather than risk being caught, she'd cut her losses and run. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd left Marcus behind. How is he? I asked. How is my son handling all of this? He wants to see you, Frank said. He's been asking about you all day, wants to understand what really happened. I think he's ready to hear the truth. The truth. After weeks of lies and manipulation, after being cast out and abandoned, after having my entire life destroyed by people I trusted, I was finally going to be able to tell my son the truth about what had happened to our family. I drove to the house the next morning, my house, I realized, since Jessica's abandonment of Marcus would complicate any legal claim she might have had to Richard's estate. The front door opened before I could knock, and Marcus stood there looking older than his 35 years, his eyes red from crying, his face haggard with stress and confusion. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the word. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around my son, holding him the way I had when he was small and scared and needed his mother to make everything all right. Except this time, I couldn't make it all right. This time, the damage was too deep, the betrayal too complete, the losses too devastating to simply forgive and forget. But I could love him. Despite everything he'd done, despite the way he'd chosen Jessica over me, despite the weeks of abandonment and silence, I could still love my child. "I know," I whispered into his hair. "I know you're sorry. And I know you were manipulated by someone who was very good at manipulation. She fooled all of us, sweetheart. She fooled all of us." We sat in the living room, my living room, with my furniture and my photographs and my memories, and I told Marcus everything. About Jennifer Caldwell's real identity, about her history of marrying and murdering wealthy men, about the affair with his father and the poisoning that had killed him. I showed him the evidence Frank and I had compiled, the financial records and witness statements and police reports that painted a picture of systematic fraud and murder. Marcus listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions, sometimes breaking down in tears as he realized the full extent of Jennifer's, deception. "She never loved me," he said finally, his voice hollow. "She never loved any of us. We were just targets. Sources of money." "I'm afraid so," I said gently. "She's a sociopath, Marcus. She's incapable of real love or genuine emotion. Everything about her was calculated to make you trust her, to make you fall in love with her, to make you willing to do anything she asked. Including throwing my own mother out of her home," Marcus said, his voice filled with self-loathing. "God, Mom, what kind of man does that? What kind of son chooses a woman he's known for 2 years over the mother who raised him? A son who was being manipulated by an expert," I said. A good man who was targeted by someone who knew exactly how to exploit his kindness and his desire to please the woman he thought he loved. We talked for hours, filling in the gaps in our understanding of Jennifer's crimes and the systematic ways she'd destroyed our family. Marcus told me about the subtle ways she'd isolated him from me, convincing him that I disapproved of their marriage, that I was jealous of their happiness, that I might become a burden to them as I aged. She'd planted seeds of doubt about my mental stability, my financial responsibility, my ability to cope with widowhood. She made me believe that Dad's will was about protecting you, Marcus said, shaking his head at his own gullibility. She said he was worried you'd make poor financial decisions if you inherited everything directly, that leaving it to me was a way of ensuring you'd always be taken care of. And then she convinced you to throw me out immediately after the funeral. She said you needed to start your grieving process, that staying in the house would prevent you from moving on. She made it sound like we were doing you a favor, forcing you to begin a new chapter of your life. A new chapter. As if being made homeless and penniless was some kind of gift, some opportunity for personal growth and renewal. I should have questioned it, Marcus continued. I should have insisted on talking to you directly, should have refused to go along with any plan that hurt you. But she was so convincing, so sure that she knew what was best for everyone. And I wanted to believe her because the alternative was admitting that Dad had betrayed you, that our family wasn't what I thought it was. None of us wanted to believe it, I said. That's what made her so effective. She exploited our love for each other, our desire to trust and protect the people we cared about. As the afternoon wore on, we began to discuss practical matters. With Jennifer gone and her legal claim to Richard's estate compromised by her criminal activities, I would likely be able to reclaim at least some of what had been stolen from me. The house, Richard's legitimate assets, perhaps even some of the money from the secret accounts if the authorities could trace it. But more importantly, I had my son back. Marcus had finally seen through Jennifer's lies and manipulation, had chosen truth over comfortable deception, had remembered that I was his mother and deserved his loyalty and love. "Will you come home?" he asked as the sun began to set. "Will you move back in here, where you belong?" I looked around the living room, at the familiar furniture and decorations, at the family photos that documented our life together before Jennifer had shattered everything. This had been my home for 37 years. These walls held my memories, my history, my heart. But could I really come back? Could I sleep in the bedroom where Richard had died, knowing that he'd been poisoned by his lover? Could I sit in the kitchen where he'd eaten his final meals, not knowing that each bite might be bringing him closer to death? Could I live surrounded by reminders of the betrayal that had destroyed everything I'd believed about my life? I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to think about it. This house, it's not the same anymore. Too much has happened here. Too many lies were told, too many secrets were kept. I understand, Marcus said. But Mom, wherever you decide to live, I want to be part of your life again. I want to try to make up for what I did, for the way I abandoned you when you needed me most. You can't make up for it, I said, and I saw him flinch at my words. What's done is done, Marcus. You chose to believe a stranger over your own mother. You watched me grieve my husband and then threw me out of my home the same day I buried him. Those are facts that can't be changed or forgiven away. But, I continued, you're still my son. You made terrible choices, but you made them because you were being manipulated by someone who was very good at manipulation. And when you learned the truth, you chose to face it instead of continuing to live in denial. That means something. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. I love you, Mom. I never stopped loving you, even when I was too confused and scared to show it. I love you too, I said. And that's why we're going to find a way forward together. It won't be the same as before. Too much trust has been broken for that. But we're family, and family finds a way to survive even the worst betrayals. Over the following weeks, as the police investigation into Jennifer Caldwell continued and the legal process of sorting out Richard's estate began, Marcus and I slowly started to rebuild our relationship. He helped me find a better apartment, a bright, airy place with a garden where I could start over without being surrounded by painful memories. He assisted with the legal paperwork and financial arrangements, making sure I reclaimed as much as possible of what Jennifer had stolen. Most importantly, he listened. He listened as I talked about the pain of betrayal, about the loneliness and fear I'd experienced, about the strength I'd discovered in myself during the darkest period of my life. And I listened as he talked about his own pain, his guilt and confusion, his struggle to understand how he could have been so completely deceived by someone he trusted with his heart. The police never found Jennifer Caldwell. She disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed, probably already working on establishing a new identity and finding new victims. But they did confirm everything Frank and I had discovered about her previous crimes. Investigations were reopened into the deaths of her former husbands, and while justice might never be fully served, at least the truth was finally known. 6 months after Richard's funeral, I made a decision about the house on Maple Street. I couldn't live there again. Too many ghosts, too many painful memories. But I couldn't bear to sell it to strangers either. Instead, I signed it over to Marcus, with the understanding that he would never sell it without my permission and that I could visit whenever I wanted to tend the rose bushes I'd planted when he was born. It was a compromise, like so many things in our slowly healing relationship. Not perfect, not quite what either of us would have chosen, but workable. A foundation we could build on. I kept Richard's wedding ring, the one I'd slipped off his finger before the funeral home took his body away. Sometimes I looked at it, and remembered the young man who had placed it on my finger 42 years ago, who had promised to love and honor me for the rest of our lives. That man had existed, I believed. That love had been real, even if it had been corrupted and destroyed in the end. But I didn't wear my own wedding ring anymore. That symbol of trust and partnership had been tainted by too many lies, too much betrayal. I was no longer the woman who had worn it proudly for 4 decades. I was someone new, someone harder and wiser and more independent. Someone who would never again allow herself to be so vulnerable to the cruelty of others. On a warm spring evening, almost a year after Richard's death, Marcus came to visit me in my new apartment. He'd been dating someone, a nurse named Sarah who seemed genuine and kind, though I'd learned to be suspicious of appearances. He brought flowers from my old rose bushes, carefully transplanted to pots so I could enjoy them in my small garden. "They're beautiful," I said, accepting the fragrant blooms. "Thank you for taking such good care of them. I know how much they mean to you," he said. "They're part of your history, part of who you are. I wanted to make sure you could still have them, even if you can't have the house." We sat on my small patio, drinking tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was peaceful, comfortable, the kind of easy companionship I'd thought we might never have again. "Mom," Marcus said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "All right. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? Really forgive me, not just say the words but actually let go of the anger and hurt?" I considered his question carefully. The anger had faded over the months, replaced by a deeper understanding of how thoroughly Jennifer had manipulated all of us. The hurt was still there, probably always would be, but it no longer consumed me the way it had in those first terrible weeks. "I think," I said slowly, "that forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once. It's a choice you make over and over again, every day. Some days I choose to forgive you. Some days I choose to remember that you're my son and that you were victimized too. And some days I choose to focus on who we're becoming rather than who we were. And what are we becoming? I smiled at him, this man who had been my baby, my little boy, my greatest joy and my deepest disappointment. We're becoming people who've survived the worst thing that could happen to a family and found a way to love each other anyway. We're becoming people who know how precious trust is because we've seen what happens when it's broken. We're becoming people who don't take anything for granted anymore. I can live with that, Marcus said. So can I. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I'd lost everything, my husband, my home, my sense of security, my faith in the people I loved most. I'd been betrayed, abandoned, and cast out by the very people who should have protected me. But I'd also discovered things about myself I'd never known. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd imagined, more resilient than I'd believed possible. I'd found the courage to fight back when everyone expected me to quietly disappear. I'd uncovered truths that others had tried to bury, and I'd survived the revelation of those truths even when they shattered everything I'd believed about my life. I was no longer the trusting, dependent woman who had buried her husband a year ago. I was someone new, someone who had been forged in the fire of betrayal and loss and had emerged transformed. Not unscathed, the scars would always be there, but undaunted. Jennifer Caldwell had taken everything from me except the one thing that mattered most, my sense of who I was and what I was capable of. She'd underestimated me, dismissed me as just another helpless widow who could be discarded once she'd served her purpose. That had been her mistake. And in the end, it was the mistake that had brought her carefully constructed world crashing down around her. I might never see justice fully served. I might never recover everything that had been stolen from me. But I had reclaimed my power, my dignity, and my relationship with my son. I had exposed the truth and prevented Jennifer from destroying another family the way she'd destroyed mine. Most importantly, I had learned that I could survive anything. That knowledge was worth more than all the money Jennifer had stolen, more valuable than the house I'd lost, more precious than the illusions about my marriage that had been shattered. I was Eleanor Patterson, and I was nobody's victim. Not anymore. Not ever again. As Marcus and I sat together in comfortable silence, watching the night sky deepen around us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: peace. Not the naive contentment I'd known before Richard's death, but something deeper and more hard-won. The peace that comes from surviving the worst and discovering that you're still standing, still breathing, still capable of love and hope and new beginnings. The old Eleanor Patterson was gone, buried along with her husband and her illusions. But the woman who remained was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might try to hurt her or the people she loved. Jennifer Caldwell might be free somewhere, living under a new name, targeting new victims. But she would always know that there was one person who had seen through her lies, one woman who had refused to be destroyed by her carefully laid plans.